Chapter 7 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman, Wills, Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 7, Concerning a Wedding. When Inspector French felt really up against it in the conduct of a case, it was his invariable habit to recount the circumstances in the fullest detail to his wife. She, poor woman, hailed from the mysterious household employments in which her soul delighted, would resignedly fetch a sewing and sit placidly in the corner of the Chesterfield while her lord and master strode up and down the room, stating his premises, arguing therefrom from ruthless logic and not a few gestures, sifting his facts, grouping them, restating them. Sometimes she interjected a remark, sometimes she didn't. Usually she warned him to be careful not to knock over the small table beside the piano, and invariably she wished he would walk on the less worn parts of the carpet. But she listened to what he said, and occasionally expressed an opinion, or, as he called it, took a notion. And more than once it had happened that these notions had thrown quite a new light on the point at issue, a light which in at least two cases had indicated the line of research which had eventually cleared up the mystery. On the second evening after his return from Spain, the inspector was regaling her with a by no means brief resume of the Hatton Garden crime. She had listened more carefully than usual, and presently he found she had taken a notion. "I don't believe that a poor old man was out to do anything wrong," she declared. "It's a shame for you to try to take away his character now he's dead." French, stopping his pacing of the room, faced round. "But I'm not trying to take away his character, Emily dear," he protested, nettled by this unexpected attack in the rear. "I'm only saying that he is the only person we know of who could have got an impression of the key. If so, it surely follows he was out to rob the safe." "Well, I believe you're wrong," the lady affirmed, continuing with a logic as relentless as his own. "Because if he was out to rob the safe, he wasn't the sort of man that you described, and if he was the sort of man that you described, why, then, he wasn't out to rob the safe. That's what I think about it." French was a trifle staggered. The difficulty he had recognized from the beginning, but he had not considered it serious. Now, put to him in the downright uncompromising language in which his wife usually clothed her thoughts, it suddenly seemed to him overwhelming. What she said was true. There was here a discrepancy. If Getting really bore the character he was given by all who had known him, he was not a thief. He ceased his restless movement, and sitting down at the table, he opened his notebook and began to look up what he had actually learned about the dead man. And the more he did so, the more he came to believe that his wife was right. Unless all this cloud of witnesses were surprisingly mistaken, Getting was innocent. His mind reverted to the other horn of the dilemma. If Getting were innocent, who took the impression of the key? It was not obtained from that in the bank, therefore it was copied from that in Mr. Duke's possession. Who had done it? No one at the office, at least not unless Mr. Duke was greatly mistaken. And he did not believe the principal could be mistaken on such a point. The breaking through of his regular custom in a matter of such importance would almost certainly be noted and remembered. No, French felt that he might rely on Mr. Duke's statement so far. But with regard to his assertion that no one in his house could have tampered with the key, the inspector saw that he was on more shaky ground. In the nature of the case, the diamond merchant would be less alert in dealing with the members of his own household than with his business acquaintances. Believing he was surrounded by friends, he would subconsciously be more ready to assume his precautions adequate. Was Mr. Duke's belief that no one would touch the key not the real basis of his statement that no one had done so? It seemed to French that there was a possibility that he had overlooked, and it was in the nature of the man that the moment he reached such a conclusion he began to consider a way of retrieving his error. At first he thought of taking Mr. Duke into his confidence and asking him to assist him in some subterfuge by which he could enter the house. But presently he saw that it would be better if the old gentleman knew nothing of this plan, lest he might inadvertently warn a possible criminal. For the same reason that Mr. Duke might get to know of it, He decided he would be wiser not to undertake the business in person. But he knew the man for the job, a certain detective sergeant named Patrick Nolan. This man was sometimes a Don Juan in his way and had a positive genius for extracting confidences from the fair sex. If he could scrape acquaintance with the maids of the establishment, it would not be long before he knew all they had to tell. Accordingly, next morning he sent for Sergeant Nolan and explained his idea, and Nolan, who, where his superiors were concerned, was a man of few words, said, "Yes, sir," and withdrew. The following day he returned with his first report. It seemed that, changing into the garb of a better-class mechanic and taking a small kit of tools with him, he had called at Mr. Duke's in the character of an electrician who had been sent to overhaul the light fittings. Miss Duke happened to be out, and the rather pretty housemaid who opened the door, charmed with the newcomer's manner, admitted him without hesitation. He had gone all over the house, paying particular attention to Mr. Duke's bedroom. In the middle of the day he had asked and been granted leave to heat his can of soup at the kitchen fire, and to such purpose had he used the opportunities thus gained that before he left he had prevailed on the pretty housemaid to go with him to supper and pictures on a next evening out. "Once I get a drop of spirits into her, I'll get all she knows," he concluded, "though I doubt if it'll be much." "That's all right, so far as it goes," French admitted. "But what have you actually found out?" "Well, there's first of all the family. It's a small one. There's only the father and daughter, Miss Sylvia. The mother is alive, but she has been in a lunatic asylum for years, quite incurable, they said. Miss Sylvia is a nice-looking young lady and well-liked by what Rachel says, that's the housemaid. Then there's the servants, this Rachel, and another girl, Annie, and Sarah, the cook, and there's a shower they call Manley. I didn't see him, but the girls seem all right. Not the kind that would be after the keys of jewel safes anyway." "What's the house like?" "It's a middling big house, and the furniture will have been good when it was bought, though it is getting a trifle shabby now. Mr. Duke's bedroom is at the end of the left wing, and Miss Duke is in the front of the house, so anybody could go through Mr. Duke's room without being seen. Anybody could get a mold of that key if he left it in his room, and say while he was having his bath." "And you find out any possibilities, any tradesmen in like yourself, or anyone staying in the house?" The sergeant shook his head. "I did not, sir," he admitted. "I thought I had maybe done enough for one day. I didn't want to be after starting them wondering about me. But I'll get that out of Rachel tomorrow night. Better see that Manley, the chauffeur, or no, I shall see him myself." "You stick to what you are at. Anything else?" "No, sir, I think not." What the girls talked about most was Miss Sylvia's engagement. It seems she was engaged to some friend in the city, and they were to have been married at the end of the month, and now they've had some bust up, and the whole thing's postponed, if not off together." "That's so." "They didn't tell you the reason?" "They did not, sir, but I can likely find out from Rachel if you want to know." "I don't suppose I do," French returned, "but you might as well find out what you can, on spec. You know who the young man is?" "No, sir, they didn't say." French looked up his notebook. "I seem to know a deal more about it than you do," he grumbled. "He's a clerk in Mr. Duke's office, name of Harrington, Stanley Harrington. I interviewed him with the others in the office on the day after the murder, and he told me about the engagement. It seemed to be going strong then." "When did they postpone it?" "They didn't say that either, sir." "Well, find that out too. That'll do for the present." That evening French, in the guise of an out-of-work mechanic, took up his stand near Mr. Duke's house, and presently saw the old gentleman arrive back from business in his car. An hour later he followed the chauffeur from the garage to a house in a small street off Esther Road. There French hung about for perhaps another hour, when he had the satisfaction of seeing the quarry emerge again, pass down the street, and disappear into the rose and thistle bar. This was just what the inspector had hoped for, and after a few minutes he followed him in. To scrape acquaintance was easy enough. French, as motor mechanic out of work, was provided with a ready introduction to any chauffeur, and over a couple of glasses of beer he learned first of the chances of jobs in the district, and secondly, by skillful pumping, many details of his new companion's work and of the Duke's menage. But he heard nothing that seemed in the slightest degree suspicious or interesting. The man himself, moreover, seemed of an honest, harmless type, and much too stupid to be concerned personally in enterprises with keys of safes. For a day the inquiry hung fire, and then Sergeant Nolan brought in a report which turned the inspector's thoughts into a still another channel. Nolan had, it appeared, taken the pretty housemaid Rachel first to the pictures and then to supper at a popular restaurant. The girl had what the sergeant called the gift of the gab, and it had only been necessary for him judiciously to supply an occasional topic to have a continuous stream of more or less relevant information poured into his receptive ears. First, he had tried to ascertain whether anyone had recently had access to Mr. Duke's dressing room during the night or early morning, and he soon learned that prior to his own visit no tradesman had been in the house for many months. Moreover, the only visitor who had stayed overnight for a considerable time was Mr. Stanley Harrington, Miss Duke's fiancé. The two young people had been feverishly engaged in rehearsals for a play given by a local amateur dramatic society, and for the 4 nights previous to the entertainment, Miss Duke had refused to allow her swain to waste time in going to and from his rooms, and had insisted on his putting up with them. This occurred about a month before the murder, and Harrington had slept in a room just opposite to Mr. Duke's. It was obvious, therefore, that had the key been left in the dressing room at any time, Harrington could easily have taken the necessary impression. Nolan then went on to tell what he had found out as to the postponed wedding, and in this French felt he had food for thought. It appeared that the trouble, whatever it was, had come suddenly, and it had taken place on the day after the murder. On the evening of the crime, so Rachel had said, Mr. Duke was not at home for dinner, but Mr. Harrington turned up. He and Miss Duke had dined together, and then everything was couleur de rose. They had gone out together after dinner. About 10, Miss Duke had returned and had gone straight to bed. Almost certainly, therefore, she had not known that night of Mr. Duke's call to the office. Next morning she had breakfasted with her father, and had presumably then learned of the tragedy. But not 5 minutes after breakfast began, she had slipped out of the room and had made a telephone call, and directly Mr. Duke had left the house, she had put on her things and followed him. She had been absent for 20 minutes, and had then gone direct to her bedroom, where, on the plea of a headache, she had spent the day. When Rachel had occasion to enter, she found her lying down, but the girl had heard her hour after hour of pacing the room, and, in her opinion, her mistress's indisposition was more mental than physical. About 4 o'clock that afternoon Mr. Harrington had called. Miss Duke saw him in her own sitting room, and during the interview some terrible quarrel must have taken place. Mr. Harrington left in about half an hour, and Rachel, who had opened the door to let him out, said that he looked as if he had received his death warrant. His face wore an expression of the most acute consternation and misery, and it seemed like a man in a dream, stupefied by some terrible calamity. He usually spoke pleasantly to the girl when leaving, but on this occasion he did not appear to notice her presence, but stumbled blindly out of the house and crept off like a broken man. Later the same evening she had seen Miss Duke, and she noticed that her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Since then the young lady had changed out of all knowing. She had become silent, melancholy, and depressed. She had grown thin and old-looking, and was eating nothing, and Rachel had opined if something were not done, they would soon see her in a decline. Inspector French was not a little intrigued by all this information. That there was a connection between the murder of Charles Getting and the postponed wedding he could scarcely believe, and yet some of the facts seemed almost to point in that direction. If Miss Duke had first learned of the tragedy from her father at breakfast, was this knowledge the cause of the telephone call? To whom was the call made? What had she done during a 20 minutes' absence from the house? What had taken place at the interview between Miss Duke and Harrington? And most important of all, why had the wedding been postponed? French felt that he could not rest until he had obtained answers to all these questions, and it seemed to him that the only way he could do so would be to trace the girl's movements in detail during the whole period in question. For a long time he continued sitting at his desk as he considered ways and means. At last he telephoned once more for Sergeant Nolan. "Look here," he began, when the man presented himself, "I want you to get something more out of that girl. When can you see her again?" "Sunday, sir," said the charmer. "I left an opening for meeting her for fear it would may be wanted, and this is Friday." "Well, I suppose I shall have to wait. Better see her on Sunday and find out these things in this order. First, in what vehicle Miss Duke drove to a friend's girls' club on the night of the crime. Secondly, what vehicle she came back in. And thirdly, whether she received any note or message between the time she returned that night and Mr. Harrington's call next day, other than what she might have learned during a telephone call and absence from the house after breakfast. Got that? Nolan signifying that he had left the room, and French turned his attention to his routine work, which had got sadly behind. On the following Monday morning, Sergeant Nolan made his report. He had taken his fair quarry up the river on Sunday afternoon, and there he had got his information. Miss Duke and Mr. Harrington had left in Mr. Duke's car shortly before 8. Manley, the chauffeur, had mentioned to Rachel that his young mistress had told him he need not wait for her, as she expected that Mr. Duke would want him later in that evening to take him home from his club. She had returned about 10 in a taxi, and had come in quickly and gone to her room. So far as Rachel knew, she had received no caller, note, or other messages from then until Mr. Harrington arrived next day, other than those expected in the question. French was anxious to keep secret the fact that he was looking into Miss Duke's doing, and he was therefore unwilling to question Manley on the matter. He had learned from Harrington the address of the girls' club, and he thought inquiries there might give him his information. Accordingly, an hour later saw him standing before a somewhat dilapidated church schoolhouse in a narrow street of drab and depressing houses in the Shadwell district. The school was closed, but inquiries next door produced the information that the caretaker lived in number 47. He betook himself to number 47, and there found a pale, tired-looking young woman with a baby in her arms, who, when he asked for a few moments' conversation, invited him into an untidy and not over-clean kitchen. She told him, in reply to his questions, that the club was run by a number of ladies, headed by a Miss Amy Lestrange. It was open each evening, but she, the speaker, was not present, her duty being only to keep the rooms clean. But her husband, the caretaker, was there off and on every evening. He might have been there when the young lady in question arrived, she did not know. But he worked in the factory nearby, and would be in for his dinner in half an hour if the gentleman liked to wait. French said he would call back presently, and strolled out through the depressing neighborhood. In 45 minutes he was back at number 47, where the caretaker had just arrived. French told him to go on with his dinner, and sat beside him as he ate. The man, evidently hoping the affair would have its financial side, was anxious to tell everything he knew. It seemed that he had been present at the club on the evening in question, and when French had described his young couple, he remembered their arrival. It was not usual for so fine a motor to penetrate the fastness of the dismal region, and its appearance had fixed the matter in his memory. The gentleman had got out first and asked him if this was the Curtis Street Club, and had then assisted his companion to alight. The lady had called to the chauffeur that he need not either wait or return for her. She had then gone into the club, leaving the gentleman standing on the pavement. About 9:30 a taxi had driven up, and the same gentleman had got out and sent him, the caretaker, in to say that Mr. Harrington was waiting for Miss Duke. The young lady had presently come down with Miss Lestrange, the head of the club. The three had walked for a few minutes, and then the strangers had got into the taxi and driven off. "She's a fine girl, Miss Duke," French observed, as he offered the caretaker a fill from his pouch. "I never have seen anything but smiling and pleasant all the years I've known her." "That's right," the man returned, gloating, lowering his pipe. "She's a peach, and no mistake." French nodded in a satisfied way. "I should have laid a quid on it," he declared, "that she would have been as smiling and pleasant going away as when she came. She always is." "Well, you'd have pulled it off. But look, governor, it's easy for ladies as what has lots of money to be pleasant. Why shouldn't they be?" French rose. "Ah, well, I expect they have their troubles like the rest of us," he said, slipping half a crown into the man's eager hand. If the caretaker was correct, and Miss Duke was in good spirits on leaving the club, it followed that the upset, whatever it had been, had not up to then taken place. The next step, therefore, was obviously to find the taxi in which the two young people had driven to Hampstead, so as to learn whether anything unusual had occurred during the journey. He returned to the yard, and sending for some members of his staff, explained the point at issue. But, as he would have been first to admit, it was more by luck than good guidance that on the very first day of the inquiry he gained his information. Taximan James Tompkins had driven the young couple on the evening in question, and by 5 o'clock he was at the yard awaiting French's pleasure. The end of chapter 7.